Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're looking at something more than just a global health crisis. We're examining uh, a moral firestorm.
Yeah.
We're diving into the ethical fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic
Mhm.
using the lens of Lewis Vaughn's bioethics framework to, really unpack it.
It was absolutely a catastrophe on two levels. I mean, you had the staggering human toll, the source mentioned, over 166 million infected, 3.4 million deaths globally when it was written. Just huge number.
Unbelievable.
But layered onto that was this intense moral catastrophe, just a constant stream of really high stakes, life and death ethical choices facing everyone, from individuals up to whole governments.
And that's really our focus for this deep dive. We want to unpack those tough moral questions. We need to look at how ethical theories guided, or maybe should have guided, decisions about scarce resources, triage.
Right.
We'll also get into what healthcare workers owe patients, and just as importantly, what society owes them in return.
Crucial point.
Then there's that whole conflict between individual freedom people saying, my body, my choice about masks or vaccines, and the need for public safety. And finally, the ethics of information, or rather misinformation, the infodemic.
Yeah, the infodemic. But before we jump into those really thorny issues, maybe let's just set the stage a bit. We know an epidemic is more cases than expected in one area,
Right.
and a pandemic is when it spreads globally. Now, science gives us the facts, how the virus spreads, like respiratory droplets, how fast, who's most at risk.
Sure, so what?
Exactly. But science can't tell us what's morally right or wrong. That's where ethics comes in. And ethical judgments have to take those scientific facts into account. You can't make good moral decisions in a vacuum.
Okay, so let's start where the pressure was maybe most intense, inside the hospitals. ICUs overflowing, not enough ventilators, not enough PPE. Doctors had to perform triage, sorting patients, deciding who gets what limited treatment.
Yeah, it's an incredibly difficult process. You're trying to balance all these competing ethical principles, justice, fairness, equity, trying to do the most good utility respecting people as individuals.
Where do you even begin with that? Sounds overwhelming.
Well, you start by ruling things out. Ethicists are pretty much unanimous on this. Things like a person's wealth, their fame, political connections, or, society's view of their moral worth. Those things should never play a role in who gets life-saving treatment.
Okay, that seems obvious, thankfully.
And, maybe less obviously, the first-come, first-served approach is also widely seen as problematic.
Wait, hold on. First come, first served. In all that chaos, wouldn't it be the fairest, most impartial way? Just take the next person in line.
It sounds fair on the surface, doesn't it? But it has some serious ethical flaws when you dig into it. First, it automatically disadvantages people who live further away or have less access to transportation. They just can't get there as fast.
Okay, geography shouldn't dictate survival. Makes sense.
But maybe even more importantly, it can end up penalizing people who are actually being careful. Imagine someone who diligently followed all the public health advice, masking, distancing. They get sick later than someone who ignored all the rules.
Right.
Under first come, first served, the careful person might arrive when the beds are already full precisely because they were responsible longer. You'd essentially be punishing their conscientiousness.
Wow, I hadn't thought of it that way. So it's actually unjust. Okay, so if we throw out wealth, fame, and first come, first served, what's left? What's the real ethical dilemma?
It really boils down to this core tension between utility and equity.
Okay, break those down. Utility is...
Utility, coming from utilitarianism, is about maximizing good outcomes. So in this context, it usually means saving the maximum number of lives, or perhaps maximizing the total number of life years saved. Get the biggest bang for your scarce resource buck, basically.
Right, save the most people.
Yeah.
And equity.
Equity is about fairness and justice. It insists that every person has an equal claim, an equal chance at receiving life-saving care, regardless of their long-term prognosis or other factors. Everyone matters equally.
And I can already see the conflict. Because maximizing the number of lives saved might mean prioritizing, say, younger patients with no other health problems over older patients or those with disabilities, because the younger ones might live longer if they survive.
Exactly. That's the agonizing part. A strict utility approach can lead directly to discriminating against the elderly or people with pre-existing conditions because their statistical odds of long recovery might be lower.
Which equity would absolutely condemn.
Fundamentally, equity says that kind of discrimination is wrong. Which brings us to thinkers like Angela Ballantyne, who really hammered this point. She argued that triage protocols relying too heavily on utility often end up reflecting and reinforcing existing social inequalities. Well, think about it. Who often has the best projected outcome in a society with deep health disparities? It tends to be people who already have advantages, often younger, wealthier, maybe white individuals who have better baseline health because of their social position. So a utility focus can inadvertently prioritize the privileged.
So the system meant to be objective actually encodes bias.
Potentially, yes. And this is a huge reason why ethicists warn against using things like quality-adjusted life years or QALYs in triage.
QALYs, I've heard that term. It tries to measure the value of a medical intervention based on both quantity and quality of life gained, right?
That's the idea. It's an economic tool, really. But using it for triage is deeply problematic. It's almost inherently biased against people with disabilities and the elderly.
Why inherently biased?
Because the calculation assigns a lower value to years lived with a disability or chronic illness. So, a protocol using QALYs might explicitly deprioritize saving someone with a significant disability compared to someone without one, even if their chances of surviving the acute illness, like COVID, are similar.
So it's making a judgment about the worth of their future life.
Essentially, yes. It makes assumptions about their quality of life that might be completely wrong. Studies show many people with disabilities rate their quality of life very highly. Using QALYs and triage risks writing societal prejudice against disability right into life and death medical decisions. It also ignores the fact that many disabilities have zero impact on surviving COVID itself.
That's incredibly sobering. Okay, before we get to the specific triage guidelines proposed by people like Emanuel, let's touch on the other side of the equation, the healthcare workers themselves. What are their ethical duties in a crisis like this?
Well, the bedrock principle is the duty of non-abandonment. Healthcare professionals have a strong ethical obligation not to abandon their patients, even when it's dangerous for them personally.
Even at great personal risk.
Even then. But, and this is a really big but, that duty isn't absolute or unconditional. It depends heavily on a reciprocal obligation from society and their institutions.
Okay, so if they have a duty to stay and treat, what does society owe them?
Society and the healthcare system owe them everything reasonably possible to minimize that risk. That means adequate PPE, access to testing, vaccines when available. It also means things like fair compensation, hazard pay, childcare support, mental health resources.
Basically, you can't just demand heroism without providing support.
Exactly. As the sources say, demanding they face extreme risks without adequate protection turns a moral duty into exploitation. The institution has to do its part to make fulfilling that duty ethically sustainable.
That balance seems absolutely critical. Okay, so let's go back to those triage guidelines. Ezekiel Emanuel and his colleagues proposed a framework trying to balance utility and equity. What stood out as particularly challenging or maybe even shocking in the recommendations?
I think the most ethically fraught recommendation came directly from that value of maximizing benefits. They argued priority should go to patients who are sick but could recover if they get the scarce resource, like a ventilator.
Okay, that sounds logical.
Yeah.
Prioritize those who can actually be saved by the treatment.
Right. But it leads to this really tough conclusion. It means prioritizing those patients over ones who are unlikely to recover even with the treatment, or over patients likely to recover without it. And here's the really hard part. This principle, they argued, could justify removing a ventilator from a patient who isn't improving to give it to someone else with a better chance of survival.
Taking away life support that's already being used?
Yeah.
Wow, that's the nightmare scenario.
It absolutely is. And to make that even remotely ethically acceptable, it would have to be a policy stated clearly and transparently to everyone upon admission. You'd have to know this was a possibility going in.
Unimaginable.
But they argued it might be necessary to save the maximum number of lives overall. They also included another important principle, instrumental value.
What's that?
That means giving some priority to essential workers, frontline healthcare staff, people keeping critical infrastructure running.
Not because their lives are inherently worth more.
No, absolutely not. But because saving them helps save everyone else. Their role is critical to the entire pandemic response effort. It's a strategic, utilitarian argument, essentially. Protect the protectors to protect the community.
Okay. And what about when you have multiple patients with similar prognosis, similar chances of survival? How do you choose then?
That's where equality comes in. For patients in similar situations, the recommendation was random allocation. Basically, a lottery.
A lottery for a ventilator.
Yes. Better than first come, first served, they argued, because it gives everyone in that group a truly equal chance. It avoids the biases we talked about earlier.
Okay, let's shift from the hospital decisions to, well, decisions made by all of us. Public health measures like masks, social distancing, vaccines. The science is pretty clear on their effectiveness, but the resistance, it was huge.
Oh, absolutely. And the reasons for resistance were really varied. You had some non-moral factors just driving it, sheer misinformation, spreading online, political polarization, making everything partisan.
Just distrust of experts in general sometimes.
Yeah, that too. But there were also really deep moral and systemic reasons. For example, the source highlights the profound, historically justified mistrust among many communities of color towards government health initiatives, citing things like the Tuskegee study, that history is real and it has consequences for trust.
So not just ignorance or politics, but legitimate historical grievances fueling skepticism.
Definitely part of the mix.
And philosophically, what was the main argument from those resisting mandates?
Often it was framed around the principle of autonomy, the idea that individuals have the right to make decisions about their own bodies and lives, free from government coercion. My body, my choice, applied to masks or vaccines.
So how does that argument stack up against the ethical counterarguments?
Well, the main counter is based on justice and respect for persons. The argument is that your autonomy, your freedom, isn't absolute when exercising it directly harms others or puts them at significant risk.
Like spreading a deadly virus.
Exactly. Refusing measures like masking or vaccination isn't just a personal choice in a pandemic. It has direct consequences for the health and safety of others. It potentially violates their right to not be harmed, so it's seen as unjust and disrespectful to others.
And this brings in the communitarian perspective, right?
Yes. Communitarian thinkers like Michael Sandel or Lori Zoloth emphasize our obligations to the common good. They'd argue that in a public health crisis, individual liberty has to be balanced against, and sometimes yield to, the collective well-being and the need to minimize risk for everyone, especially the vulnerable. Your freedom shouldn't come at the cost of widespread illness and death.
And speaking of vulnerability, Sandel and also Charles M. Blow pointed out something really important about measures like social distancing.
Yeah, the idea that we can all just stay home.
It was a myth, wasn't it? A dangerous one.
Absolutely. Social distancing, the ability to work from home, order groceries online, that was a privilege. It simply wasn't an option for millions of essential workers, often low-wage workers, disproportionately people of color.
They had to go out. They had to work, ride crowded buses, stock shelves.
Precisely. They were facing the choice between contagion and starvation, essentially. While others, the Zoom class, as Blow put it, could isolate in relative safety.
So that created a moral obligation for those who could stay home.
Yes. A responsibility to recognize that privilege and to actively support those essential workers. That means advocating for things like hazard pay, guaranteed health care, paid sick leave, tangible support for the people taking risks so society could function. The pandemic really threw these deep structural inequalities into sharp relief.
It exposed fault lines that were already there. Okay, finally, let's talk about the infodemic, this massive wave of false information that accompanied the virus.
A co-conspirator in the tragedy, as the source puts it. I mean, look at the U.S. stats mentioned 4% of world population, but at one point, 22% of global COVID deaths. Misinformation undeniably played a role in that terrible outcome.
We need to be clear on terms here. What's the difference between misinformation and disinformation?
It's about intent. Misinformation is simply false information. It's factually incorrect, but the person spreading it might not know it's false. They might be mistaken or misled themselves.
Okay, just wrong facts.
Right. Disinformation, on the other hand, is deliberately false information. It's a lie, spread with the intent to deceive.
And ethically, why is lying, spreading disinformation, so bad, beyond just being wrong?
Because it fundamentally undermines personal autonomy. To make rational, informed choices about your life, you need accurate information. Lies interfere with that ability to choose freely based on reality. Both misinformation and disinformation, though, can obviously have tragic, real-world consequences.
So there are different levels of blame, ethically speaking.
Yeah, you can think of a scale. At the worst end are the deliberate deceivers, people knowingly spreading lies for political gain or profit or whatever motive, like the snake oil salesman knowingly selling poison.
Okay, clear villains.
Then you have self-deceivers. These are people who aren't necessarily setting out to lie to others, but they cling to false beliefs themselves, maybe because it fits their worldview or political identity, even when there's strong evidence against it. They might be morally responsible if they actively resisted evidence or could have known better.
Motivated reasoning, basically.
Kinda, yeah. And then there's a third category, highlighted by philosopher Harry Frankfurt, the bullshitters.
Ah, the bullshitter. Not quite a liar, not quite telling the truth.
Exactly. The bullshitter doesn't actually care whether what they're saying is true or false. Their goal isn't to convey truth or falsehood about the topic, it's to manipulate the audience's perception of themselves. They want to sound smart or important or persuasive, regardless of the facts.
And they can do just as much damage.
Absolutely. Because they pollute the information environment. They show a complete disregard for truth, which erodes public trust and makes it harder for anyone to figure out what's real. They can be just as dangerous as deliberate liars.
So, faced with all this deceivers, self-deceivers, bullshitters, what's our defense? How do we navigate this?
The fundamental defense is critical thinking, developing what the source calls reasonable skepticism. Not cynicism, not rejecting everything, but demanding evidence. And recognizing illegitimate reasons for believing something like, I believe it because I want it to be true, or I reject it because it comes from a source I don't like.
Those are good reasons. We need actual evidence or reliable authority.
Precisely. And there's a practical strategy suggested, which I think is really useful. Read laterally.
Read laterally. What does that mean?
It means when you encounter a piece of information online, especially from a source you don't know, don't just stay on that page and read down. That's reading vertically. Instead, quickly open new browser tabs and search for the source itself, the website, the author, the organization. See what other reliable sources say about them.
Ah, so you're investigating the investigator, essentially. Checking their credibility before you trust their information.
Exactly. It helps you escape potential echo chambers or biased sources before you get sucked into their narrative. It's about context and verification from multiple points.
That's really practical advice for everyone online. Okay, so wrapping this up, this deep dive really highlights these intense ethical conflicts the pandemic forced on us. It was this constant balancing act, wasn't it?
Definitely. Balancing utility, trying to save the most lives against equity, ensuring fairness, especially for the vulnerable and disadvantaged.
And that other huge conflict, individual autonomy, our desire for freedom versus our communitarian duties, our obligations to protect each other, and the common good.
Yeah, and I think what the pandemic really did, ethically speaking, was expose the cracks that were already there. The deep social inequalities, the political polarization, the erosion of trust. These things existed before COVID, but the crisis amplified them and showed how much they hinder our ability to respond effectively and ethically.
So the virus didn't create the divisions, it revealed them.
In many ways, yes. Which leaves us with this big, lingering moral question going forward. How do we start to repair that social fabric? How do we rebuild the solidarity and trust we clearly need to face not just the next pandemic, but all the other major challenges coming our way? What's the lasting moral lesson we take from this?
A profound question indeed, and one for all of us to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the complex, often painful ethics of the pandemic. We hope this exploration has given you a clearer framework for thinking through these vital issues.